In this video, we're going to be looking at React Query. Now, what is React Query? React Query is a data fetching library for React framework. It's become quite popular over the last year or so. It's mainly because it simplifies a lot of things related to asynchronous data fetching for your applications. So how does it simplify things? Well, it's mainly related to the state management. You don't have to write complex code and logic to manage the state management of your asynchronous data fetching. You just write a few lines of code and you're ready to go. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to refactor your old code that uses useEffect and state management into code that will utilize React Query. So to follow along, you need to go to the GitHub and get the code that I'm using for this tutorial. So once you get that, then you can follow along with the tutorial. You can find the link to that the code in the comment section of this video. So let's get started by looking at the old way of doing it. So let's look at an example. What you're looking at here is a script that fetches some data asynchronously from a site called Swappy, and what we're fetching is the planets of in Star Wars, and then it renders it out. Okay, so if I go to the Swappy site, okay, so you can get details on the Star Wars planets, spaceships, vehicles, people, films, and species. And you can get an endpoint that you can use in your applications. This is purely for testing. So that's what Swappy does. So if I go back into the script, okay, so in a usual script that fetches data asynchronously, you'll have a section where you have you declare your state variables. So I've got 3 state variables here. You've got isLoading, isError, and data. So these are needed so that you're telling the user, what state your application is in. So, in the render, if there's an error, you put, oh, something went wrong. Or if it's loading, then you put in a message saying it's loading. So that you don't get any horrible error messages. So these are standard things that you need as state variables. Then you have your useEffect hook. And this is where you synchronously do your data fetching, and it synchronizes with React rendering as well. So when on the first initial load, you're not going to get any data. It's only after the first render the hook kicks in. So first, you set your error and set loading to false and true, and then you have this try catch block of code. What it's doing is it's doing an asynchronous fetch, and then it will set the data. Otherwise, if there's an error, then it will set an error flag there. Then once that's done, then it will set the loading to false because it's got a response. So it's invoking the fetch data here. So this is the fetch data function, and this is where we're invoking it. Okay, so the render part, so we've got some conditional rendering here so that when there's an error, we output a useful message there. If it's loading, then we output is a loading message, and I've got a ternary here, expression. So if it is loading, then output this. Otherwise, if else, you're outputting the data. So in the data rendering part, what I'm doing is I'm stringifying the data that we received, and making sure that it's not an empty object. Okay, this is because in initial render we've set the state to the state of data to empty. So if it's an empty object, then we don't want to render anything. It's only if it's not empty object, then we want to render. So that's what we're doing here. So So when we get the results back, it'll be an object with some results in there. So if I go back to the swappy data structure, what data is to expect, we can see that we have an object, and then within the object we have an item called results, and that results is an array of objects that returns our planet. So that's what we're mapping through the results and getting an output in the planet name. So I've done this to simplify things, and I've also, you know, the callback in the map is returning a JSX. The callback from the map is returning a JSX here. Usually, you'll have another component. You'll be rendering another component. So just to make everything simple, so I've done. That's why I've done this part like this. So just to simplify this, that's why I've done it this way. Okay, now let's go into the browser. I've got this application running at the moment, and if I go to the browser now, I can see it running. So if I do a refresh, and it will refresh, and if you're quick enough, you can see the loading message. It's too quick. So what I can do is I'll go back and I can set a sort of a delay so that we can see the set loading message come up. So if I go to the useEffect hook, and where it says set loading false, so I'm setting the state variable here, so for the loading. So if I pass that into a set timeout and delay it up by a few seconds, let me just do that. Set timeout, and remember you have to pass this as an arrow function, otherwise it won't run properly. So I'm going to pass that down as an arrow function into set timeout, and in the set timeout you give a duration of, I'll say something like 3000, which is 3 seconds. Okay, so if I go back into browser, so as you can see now there's a delay, and you can see the loading, and then it loads. Okay, so loading, and it loads. Okay, so just one more. Okay, so it's consistent. So I've got a 3 second delay here, so that we know what's happening. So otherwise, it's difficult to know what's happening. That's one of the problems of having, asynchronous calls and using useEffect. That is, it's a bit difficult to troubleshoot these problems. So this is one way of troubleshooting problems. Just putting a set timeout. So the problems with this method is, you gotta sort of keep a track of all these states, and then you gotta change it, then you gotta check it, and then you gotta go down and to see how that affects the rendering part, and so you have to sort of, there's quite a lot of headache trying to just following the code and remembering these sort of rules. So generally, just remembering these things, these rules that you have to follow for each time you need to do asynchronous calls. So in general, it's just too much wasting brain power to do something that should be straightforward. So fetching data from an external server should be a simple task. But as you can see from this code, it's quite complex. So React Query is a component that aims to solve this problem. And now I'm on their document site, and what they talk about is that developers have sort of come up with their own ways of writing how to fetch data, and this has resulted in there's no standards. So if I go and read 2 pieces of code, they do it in 2 different ways. So this aims to standardize the way we're gonna fetch data, basically, and And they talk a lot about state management because that's the main central problem with data fetching asynchronously, and everyone's relied on components like Redux to do this, but Redux hasn't really solved the problem. So then there's also problems with caching, and when, especially in single page applications, when you're on a site for like 1 hour, when do you update the data, and there's all sorts of algorithms, or it's complex ways of doing that, and this aims to solve those problems as well, the caching problem, and knowing when the data is out of date, and reflecting updates to data as quickly as possible. So there's sort of more complex problems that this aims to solve. So let's look at some code. So they've got sample code here. So the way you would use it is, you do npm install and React query, and then within your scripts you will import the required modules. So here you've got the query client provider, and use query. And then the way you would use it is it's a bit like Redux. You create an object using a query client. So this will create a React query object that will and then you can use this query client object within your application. So assume that they've got example component there. So that, imagine that is your application, and you wrap it around query client provider. So it's a bit like, as I said, Redux, and you use that object. Well, that object becomes available to your application. So, and all the state variables will be inside there. So you don't have to worry about your state variables and your data. It will all be inside there. You just so in your example component, you use the useQuery hook to hook into the state variables and the data. So as you were doing here. Now the useQuery will have two parameters. One is the name of the query. You can give it something relevant. And then you have the fetching function. So here we're using fetch, and it's an asynchronous fetch, standard JavaScript fetch. But we'll be using Axios, so that's the only difference. So, and then when you come to, you can render your application with if condition. If it's loading, then render this. If error, then render this. Then else, if it's not an error, and if it's not loading, then the data's been fetched, then you render this. So this looks much simpler. So it'd be a good idea to read through this and make sense of the concept behind React query. So especially the code part, it's quite easy to implement. So that's the general structure of the code when you use a React query. So what we're going to do is we're going to refactor our code to use a React query. So if I go back to the beginning, so in the beginning, this is how you use the query client provider wrapper. So we need to use that on the root component where our app is loaded. Okay, so in our case, it will be index.js. Okay, so I'm just going to copy this part and then into our index.js. Then we're going to install. So I'm going to go to the index.js. Okay, so I'm going to just tidy this part up. I don't need that. Okay, this is just boilerplate stuff that when you create an app installs. Okay, so I'm gonna copy paste that, and I'm gonna move this import command just under the import of React. Okay, so we're gonna be using query client module and query client provider module. We're not going to be using this. We're going to be using use query in the app.js, so we don't need that. Okay, so colon there. Oops, a little bit of a typo there. Okay, so all right, so I've got moved that there. So I'm going to be using a constant called query client, which is equal to a new query client, which is that module. Okay, so this is basically going to be our query client object, which will have our data and the error and is loading status. So mainly our state variables. Okay, so now we're going to put in a wrapper here, right? And the wrapper is going to be it's going to be a query client provider. Okay, so I just copy that. So go to query client provider, and so I'm going to wrap this around the app. So that's the query client provider. Now the query client provider has an attribute called client, which is equal to curly bracket, and it's going to be the query client that we created. So we're going to feed in that object with there. Okay, so this is the general setup. Okay, so we've got it all up and run. We've got it all wired up to use React Query now. So remember, we haven't installed React Query yet, so that's what we're going to do next. So we'll go to terminal, new terminal, and it's just an npm install React Query, and that takes a few minutes. So installed. Okay, so I'll close this. Okay, so I can just go into the app and make sure the app is running. Okay, so I do a refresh. Okay, so it's running. There's no errors. So these the basic code that we put in here, it's okay. There's no errors in it. So that's good. All right. So now we go into the app.js. Okay. What we need to do here is we need to load. Okay. So I can do an import curly brackets, and it's from React Query, and what we need is use query. So we're going to use query in here. Okay, so we don't need these state variables anymore. So we can take rid of that. So, and we don't need the useEffect. We're going to be using the Axios. Okay, so I'm going to just copy that and to the top. Okay, and just get rid of the useEffect hook. We don't need that. Okay, so we've simplified so much code so far. So as you can see, we've simplified quite a bit of code here. Okay, now if I go back to the docs, okay, and so all we got to do is I'm gonna copy and paste this, and we're just gonna change something, right? So I'm gonna copy that section, right? And what it's doing is, we're destructuring use query because we loaded use query there. And we're using it here. So this is going to get access to our, if you recall, our query client, which has the data and the state variables for our fetch. Okay, so when we destructures, we're extracting is loading error and data. Right, so and it usually has a name, so we just give it a name, SW API, right, and then we're gonna, so it takes a callback function. So our callback function, so remember I copied this part, so I'm just going to rename that to fetch. You can call it a different name. I'm not calling it, for any specific reasons. You can call it our fetch or anything. Okay, so so this accepts a callback and it's an arrow function. So I'll just replace my fetch in there. So I do fetch. I invoke the fetch in there. Okay, so just tidy that up. Okay, so I'm destructuring the data from useQuery, and the useQuery has two parameters: the name of the fetch, the name of the fetch, and then it has a callback function for our fetch. So we're using Exos. That's why we've created a constant and fetch equals Exos. So remember, we copy that. We don't need the await. Okay, we don't need that. It's going to cause an error. So it's just going to be a plain Axios fetch. Okay, so we're feeding in there, and then we should get access to is loading error and data. Okay, so remember we used error there. We used is error, so we need to change that to error because that's a different name. Okay, so change that to error, and this should work, I think. So if I go, so I made a spelling mistake there, so I'll just go back. React query. It's React. Okay, so okay. So it's loading. Okay, cannot read property results of undefined. Okay, this is probably because the data is in a different format. Okay, so okay, to simplify things, I'm gonna just comment this section out. Okay, then I'm gonna just copy this JSON I'm going to copy the JSON to string piece of code and put that in curly brackets. Okay, and then I want to so it's got another brackets there. So got extra bracket there. Okay, so I've just copied that JSON stuff, and then I'm gonna see what that echoes out. Okay, so it's loading. Okay, something went wrong. Let me just go and inspect and the console. Okay, it says fetch is not a function. Okay, so it's to do with our fetch. Okay, so I know what the problem is, because you can put the Axios straight in there. It should work. Right? I think I don't need to invoke it there. I just need to. All right. So if I do that, let me just see. Refresh. Okay, so it's bringing the data in. Okay. Okay, so this works. So I can just replace that with just fetch, and that should work. So I do save and then refresh. Okay, so it's working. All right. So to get a better idea of what is being returned, what I can do is just put a semicolon there. Right. I can say if data, then so if there's any data, we need to console.log and data, right? So we can see what data is being we're receiving. So we need to know the structure of the data. So the object is okay. So we're getting an object, and we've got a data item inside there, which is an object, and within there we've got results. So basically we've got data, and then we've got another data inside there. So the structure of this data is a little bit different from what we had before. So we've got the data object, and we've got another data object inside there. So knowing that, we can undo this code now, right? Oops. So I can uncomment this, okay, and then remove this, all right? So as you recall, we're checking for an empty object here. And then if it's not an empty object, then we got some data back. So in the data, remember we got data here, and then we got data within the data. So we have to put data dot, because we got a data. We're looking at a data object, and it's got an item called data inside there as well. So that's something that you need to be wary of. Okay, so if I do that, save, and there you go. So our list is rendering now. Our planet list is rendering. So all this code works. So one last thing to note on this, we're using a particular rendering logic that's different from the documentation for React query. So in the React query, it's using a more simplified rendering logic. What we're doing here is, we got this in the arrow. We're using an and expression to render any error messages. And if it's loading, if the status is loading, then we're using a ternary to say, to render the loading. Otherwise, else we render the data. So we can change this to a simplified version. So if I go back to the docs, okay, so we can use this logic. So just copy that, and we just need to do some a little bit of refactoring here. So I just copy that, and that should work. Then in the return part, we don't need to render the loading and error. So I can just take out that section. So we need the header. So we just take out that section, and then we don't need that section. Okay, so if I save that, and that should give us. So if I refresh, okay, so it's rendering. So if I just change that to XXX, that should give us an error. So if I go back and refresh, loading, an error has occurred. Request failed to save. So that's working. So just put it back and make sure it's working again. Okay, so it's loading. So there you go. Oops. Okay, so there you go. It's working. So I've simplified the logic for data as well. So I've simplified the rendering logic here. So I don't need this. That was just for troubleshooting. All right. So that's the final code. And so I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you liked it, please subscribe to my channel, and see you in the next video. Thank you.